2 hours. 2 hours is all it took to erase millennia of human civilization, and most of humanity along with it, from the face of a tired and war-torn planet. The nuclear exchange that occurred on October 23rd, 2077, forever altered the course of history and is the defining moment of the Fallout universe. Like most events of such grand scale, this so-called Great War was not an isolated incident, but rather a culmination of decades of geopolitical tensions, environmental collapse, and social decay. The bombs dropping was merely a symptom of a sick world, and to understand the cause of this illness, let us go back to the turbulent times preceding the nuclear inferno that consumed the planet. A 2 decade long period of continuous conflict, civil unrest, and epidemics known collectively as the Resource Wars.
War. War never changes.
The iconic tagline of the Fallout franchise addresses not the ever-evolving methods of sending your fellow man to meet whatever god they believe in, but rather the fundamental drivers of conflict: ideology, power, resources, and realistically, a combination of those three and many other different factors. The Fallout universe was almost identical to our own up to a certain historical point, but somewhere after the end of the Second World War, it went down its own path, something I have discussed in detail in this video. Nowhere is the divergence between the two worlds seen more pronounced than in the technological path taken in Fallout. Instead of developments in the field of microelectronics that define our current society, the Fallout universe rather saw incredible advancements in nuclear energy and its various applications. Despite incredible developments in nuclear technologies, oil was still the cornerstone of industry.
Goddamn right.
Not just remaining an important fuel through its derivatives, such as diesel and petrol,
What the fuck did you say?
that's gasoline for those of you across the Atlantic, but also having other crucial applications, such as medicine, plastics, and fertilizer, among many others. Uranium, then, was the key component for nuclear fission, which accounted for a substantial amount of worldwide electricity production. The proverbial excrement started hitting the fan around the early 21st century, when demand began overtaking supply. The finite uranium and the fossil fuel that is oil are both, unfortunately, non-renewable resources, and to add to the problem, are also unevenly distributed across the globe. With both the stockpiles and production of oil in particular dwindling, global powers scrambled to secure remaining resources. It is easy to be pleasant when life flows by like a song. Yet, as the situation deteriorated rapidly around the world, international relations began to break down, and both protectionism and nationalism were on the rise. By the middle of the century, the situation was so dire that the United States began applying significant political pressure on Mexico to secure its own economic interests. The US imposed major political and economic sanctions on their southern neighbor, a major global oil exporter, in order to destabilize the Mexican state. Eventually, in 2051, the flimsy pretext of political instability and pollution was used as a sorry excuse for a full-scale military intervention. As a justifiable and based reason for full-scale liberation of the country, all to ensure that the Mexican oil refineries were kept running, and, more importantly, continuing to supply a steady stream of petroleum north across the border. With the clarity of hindsight, many agree that it was this invasion that was the first in a chain reaction of events that would eventually engulf the world in atomic flames. Ironically, it did little to sustain the collapsing US economy, and panic reached the general population after a television documentary was aired showing the dried up husks of the Texas oil fields, once the lifeblood of American industry, now motionless in an empty and eerie silence. Perhaps a rather conveniently placed piece of government propaganda to inoculate the public against future atrocities committed in the name of resource security.
Coincidence? I think not!
Meanwhile, the situation across the Atlantic in the Old World was also dire and would eventually result in the following the shining example of the United States, the European Commonwealth, the fallout version of the European Union, responded with military action to the oil price gouging by exporters in the Middle East in the year 2052. And so begun the resource wars has, with the Middle East being invaded by Western powers for the sake of oil. Well, you got me, Bethesda. I guess war does never change. The flaccid United Nations, previously hilariously impotent to stop the US invasion of Mexico, imploded completely at this point and were officially disbanded as international relations reached rock bottom and began to dig. The war between Europe and the Middle East would rage on for almost a decade and, ironically, caused the price of oil to shoot up even further, as many smaller nations went completely bankrupt, the conflict draining their already dwindling funds and resources. Tensions would reach their peak in 2053 when a nuclear device was detonated in the middle of Tel Aviv by a terrorist organization, which resulted in further localized and limited nuclear exchanges between the belligerents of the war. The use of nuclear weapons for the first time since the end of World War II sent shockwaves throughout the world, and in response to the now very real and very possible threat of atomic annihilation, the United States government initiated Project Safehouse in 2054. This national defense initiative endeavored to create shelters, or vaults, that would protect the population against potential nuclear war. The government contract for the construction of these shelters would be won by a defense company known as Vault Tech, which would use this opportunity to eventually grow into the largest corporation in the US. The impoverished state, however, struggled to finance the project, and only 122 vaults would be commissioned, allowing for the sheltering of only about 0.1% of the entire population. The astronomical costs for the construction of even a single vault would be further exacerbated by its circumstances. The project was highly classified under the new amended Espionage Act, and the hidden nature of the Vault project resulted in a lack of oversight, allowing for plenty of corruption, embezzlement of funds, and with Vaultec essentially being given free rein over the initiative, eventually something much more sinister than mere dishonest financial manipulations. While the old world was ravaged by conflict, across the ocean things were no better. The year 2053 saw the emergence of an infectious and highly contagious virus, known simply as the New Plague. The virulent epidemic spread easily through social contact, and it became so widespread that a national quarantine was eventually mandated. Never let a good crisis go to waste. And so, the government took the opportunity to close its borders, and used the paranoia surrounding the virus to increase surveillance and control over the population, advocating for social isolation and discouraging assemblies. Wait, when did they write this? 1997.
What else are you hiding from me?
By 2055, the situation was so dire that a defense contractor known as West Tech, also famous for eventually developing the iconic power armor, was tasked by the Department of Defense to develop a cure for the epidemic. Unfortunately, the biomedical wing of the company would not be successful in creating a countermeasure for the plague. However, their experience with virus-related projects would lead them to eventually being chosen by the government to work on immunization agents to foreign bioweapons, resulting in the development of the pan-immunity virion and, subsequently, the FEV, or the Forced Evolutionary Virus. The very same virus responsible for the creation of supermutants and other iconic Fallout monstrosities. Interestingly, very little is known about the end of the new plague. It seemed to have simply disappeared, with only a few references made in-game, and no known cases of infection post-war. The plague was supposed to be expanded upon in the cancelled game Van Buren, but that sadly never came to be. As the war raged between Europe and the Middle East, the US continued to struggle against the pandemic, its resource-deprived economy continuing the downward spiral. The government, in desperation, pursued multiple promising technologies in hopes of solving the resource crisis, including the development of advanced artificial intelligences, alternative methods of propulsion to alleviate the reliance on oil, and nuclear fusion as a more powerful alternative to nuclear fission. With international relations at an all-time low, the military received extensive funding and steps were taken in anticipation of a possible conflict. By the 2050s, the state of Alaska gained critical importance, not only as a blue water port, but also for its crude oil deposits. The region saw large-scale buildup of military presence, and in 2059, the Anchorage Front Line was established close to the namesake town to defend against potential invasions across the Bering Strait. The oil pipeline ran from Alaska to the mainland United States through Canada, and the US government began pressuring their northern neighbor into permitting American troops to be stationed near the pipeline for its protection, the beginning of the process of erosion of Canadian sovereignty that would eventually lead to its annexation as the 51st state. The next year, 2060, saw the conclusion of the European Middle Eastern War, with the exhaustion of the oil deposits in the region rendering the war pointless. The conflict had no clear winner, rather only losers of varying degrees of severity, a theme rather common in Fallout. The European Commonwealth itself began to dissolve, as many countries, hopelessly bankrupt, withdrew from the organization. The continued global oil deficiency eventually rendered conventional cars defunct and obsolete, slowing traffic worldwide, yet another symptom of a dying society. Amidst a collapsing world, somewhat of a grim consolation for at least 0.1% of the US population, was the completion of the majority of vaults. Evacuation drills became frequent as the public was trained for the possible disaster scenario. Various other parties across the country also prepared for the seemingly inevitable nuclear doom, with the eccentric, genius billionaire playboy philanthropist Robert House taking precautions to ensure the city of Las Vegas would survive the impending apocalypse. Preparations for a conventional ground war were also in full swing. Due to the resource constraints in deploying large and energy hungry combat vehicles like tanks and armored personnel carriers, they would fall out of popularity in military doctrine. Instead, the military and their adjacent defense contractors began developing powered exoskeleton armor suits as an alternative mechanized cavalry. Early power armor prototypes were just that, the first uncertain and often unsuccessful steps of a new idea. However, the valuable lessons learned paved the way for advancement in other applications, such as the development of the previously mentioned nuclear fusion in the year 2066. This new fusion technology is an essential component of the Fallout universe, and it can be seen as the energy source for multiple items in game, from power armor to laser weapons and robots. The fusion technology was heralded as the solution to the severe resource shortage that affected the entire globe, and its reveal coincided with the United States declaration that it would immediately cease trading fossil fuels to any foreign nation. The other superpower of the world, China, was very much reliant on the US supplied oil, and with imports being cancelled, the Chinese economy was on the brink of utter collapse. Diplomacy between the two nations would fail, and in December of 2066, a desperate China would launch an all out invasion of Alaska, setting off the events of Chinese forces, supported by a massive airborne assault, would land in Alaska under the command of General Jing Wei in the winter of 2066. Despite the US building up the Anchorage front line in anticipation of a potential attack, the overwhelming assault of the desperate Chinese forces would send the defending American troops into retreat. China would gain control over Alaskan oil reserves, their gambit paying off, and their economy given a much needed lifeline. The US was unable to appropriately retaliate and was further hampered by the reluctance of the Canadian government to allow American troops to cross its soil and airspace, thus restricting reinforcements to the front line. Tensions between the two countries rose, and Canada eventually reluctantly agreed, or was made to agree, into allowing military access for the US. This event marked another stepping stone towards the eventual total annexation of Canada. By the year 2067, the first functional models of power armor suits would see deployment to the front lines. Designated the T-45, this initial model would be of crude construction. However, it would still prove to be shockingly successful. The mobile yet sturdy platform, allowing for heavy weapon usage, effectively countered both Chinese armor and infantry. Newly formed power armor units under the command of General Constantine Chase were instrumental in stabilizing the Alaskan front line, and eventually even retaking land from the advancing Chinese army, which scrambled to develop their own version of the wonder weapon. Despite its early success, power armor was not the pivotal moment that the US hoped for, and the conflict would degenerate into a decade-long war of attrition. Attrition not only of manpower, but of the already limited resource stockpiles. To support the ongoing war effort, the US turned to their occupied Canadian territories, liberally using the country's natural resources for their own purposes. Despite multiple protests by the Canadian population, entire stretches of timberland were destroyed by deforestation as the war squeezed what little natural resources the land had left. Tensions would keep rising until 2072, when riots broke out across Canada and an attempt was made to sabotage the vital Trans Alaskan pipeline. This was all the excuse the United States needed to officially annex their northern neighbor, it being informally already part of the American Empire, referred to as Little America for several years by the general public. The riots were crushed, and protesters were shot on sight, and sometimes even executed on camera. Thus, Canada became the 51st state
I'm gonna come.
and was mercilessly exploited for its resources and strategic location. The war against China, meanwhile, raged on. Both sides made attempts to break the stalemate. The US commissioned the development of Liberty Prime, a superweapon meant to retake Alaska. However, the resource cost of the project proved to be too high. The Chinese, on the other hand, took a more subtle approach. They released biological weapons across the front line, prompting the US government in 2073 to order WestTech to develop the pan-immunity virion we discussed earlier. A noteworthy escalation occurred in the following year, 2074. Despite being engaged in a defensive war, the US counter-invaded mainland China in hopes of destabilizing their adversary by opening a second front line. This ambitious endeavor would turn into yet another stalemate, as both supply lines and the American troops themselves were pushed to their limits by fighting a war on three fronts: the Alaskan front line, the Canadian Civil War, and now the invasion of mainland China. By the year 2076, the war had been going on for an entire decade. While the Chinese were focused on improvements to their stealth technologies, the total annexation of Canada helped bolster the US economy, and with additional resources and funding, a new model of T-51 power armor was developed. Much like the deployment of the first iteration of power armor, the use of the T-51 also started to turn the tides of war, with the most recent model aiding in the collapse of Chinese front lines. China's dire situation was further exacerbated by a breakdown of supply lines, as the neighboring countries previously annexed by China began to revolt against the occupation. The US, however, was unable to take full advantage of this, as they too had domestic problems. Food shortages resulted in riots across the country, as well as labor protests against workers being replaced by automation. The government was swift to respond by declaring martial law, as well as rounding up Chinese Americans into concentration camps, the country steadily following in the footsteps of Austrian painterman to become a de facto dictatorship. In 2077, spearheaded by power armor units, the US forces managed to completely encircle the Chinese troops in Alaska. Their supply lines collapsed, and reinforcements unavailable. And so, Alaska was finally liberated after a decade of fighting, and the commanding general Jing Wei himself was killed in action. The troops from the Alaskan theater were swiftly redeployed, either to support the invasion of China or to put down domestic riots. Despite the additional reinforcements, the US troops in Asia suffered from severe manpower shortages, and the war, once again, turned into a bloody stalemate.
God damn it! Same shit, different day!
The last major theater of the war was in Mambajaw in the Philippines, where the US troops were successful in pushing out the Chinese forces. However, both sides realized that after 10 years of conflict, the war was unwinnable for either side. With this realization, the two belligerents engaged in diplomacy. However, the negotiations would stall as the US president and key government officials disappeared, secretly relocating to an offshore oil rig in anticipation of a nuclear exchange. These members of the deep state would form what later came to be known as the Enclave and make ready to take over the post nuclear America, or whatever would be left of it after the event known as the diplomatic talks collapsed on the morning of October 23rd, 2077. Unknown submersible objects were observed off the coast of California, and a squadron of high-altitude bombers were sighted off the Bering Strait and were believed to be Chinese. At 9:13 Eastern Time, the early warning systems detected the first 4 missile launches, and the US responded with a retaliatory strike. The bombs would drop first on the West Coast, and then New York and Pennsylvania at 9:42. 5 minutes later, at 9:47, Washington, D.C. would be hit, as most American facilities went offline. And so, the most important war in history was also by far the shortest, the nuclear exchange lasting only 2 hours, a mere blink of an eye in the span of even a single human lifetime, but enough to devastate the entire globe and forever alter the course of history. But the account of the Great War, its immediate consequences, as well as unhinged speculation as to who actually launched the first nuke, is a story for another day. And that, my friends, is the story of the Resource Wars, the chain of events that led up to the series-defining nuclear exchange. Corporate and government greed, global pandemics, conflict in the Middle East, and major powers engaging in bloody attritional war all led to inevitable disaster. And all I can say is that I applaud the creativity of Fallout writers in creating these interesting, but let's be honest, totally unrealistic scenarios for their wacky alternative reality. Seriously, none of this happened until mid-century in Fallout. We are speedrunning these. Big thank you to all of you for the support, positive comments, and constructive criticism.
Kill yourself!
Huge shout out to my 2 members, Giant Gimli and Jason West. You boys are the best. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and maybe even subscribe, and I am always open to suggestions on what you guys want to see next, be it Fallout, Elder Scrolls, or something else entirely. Huge thank you for watching, and as always, until we meet again.